You know that moment at a kitchen sink? The water's running, you've got fish scales stuck to your fingers, and you're trying to decide whether the smell is fresh ocean or we've made a mistake. That's the kind of ordinary scene I want to start from, because buried inside it is one of the strangest things a parasite can do. It eats a fish's tongue and then takes the tongue's place. Not metaphorically, literally. Cymothoa exigua is the name, and it sounds like a password you'd forget on purpose. It's a parasitic isopod, which means it's in the crustacean family, the same broad world as crabs and shrimp. Not worms, not bacteria, not some vague movie monster category. It gets into fish through the gills, which makes sense once you remember fish are breathing through a wet, exposed doorway right next to the mouth. That's the entry point. Then the juvenile form, called a manca, crawls into the gill chamber and starts feeding on the tongue's blood until the tongue atrophies. So the fish loses its own tongue and the parasite settles onto the stump where the tongue used to be. The fish keeps going. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the gross part, though yes, that too. The functional part. The parasite isn't just destroying tissue and leaving. It's occupying a job. That is what makes it unique among known parasites. It doesn't just live on a host, it replaces an organ in form and function. And once you know that, the story gets less like a one-off freak and more like a really efficient, deeply unsettling adaptation. The host fish usually survives. It can keep feeding because the isopod sits where the tongue should be and gives the fish something to press food against while it chews. You could almost call it a prosthetic. Except, the prosthetic is also the thing that ate the original equipment. Very polite of nature. Very rude, actually. What's wild is that this isn't a the fish dies immediately story. Infected fish can look relatively normal from the outside. That's why the parasite is so interesting to biologists. It creates a trade-off. The fish stays alive and functional enough to keep feeding, but it's also paying a chronic price. Research and summaries of the biology point to tissue damage in the mouth and gills, mild anemia, slower growth, malnutrition, and lower reproductive potential. So the fish isn't thriving, it's coping. There's a difference. If that sounds abstract, think about it in human terms. A body part is gone, something else is doing the job, and on the surface, you're still getting through the day. But under the hood, the system is leaking energy. That's the story here. Not instant collapse, not dramatic rupture, chronic drain. And that's often how biology really works, by the way. Not with fireworks, but with accumulations. The parasite's range matters too. Most of the well-known records center on marine fish in the eastern Pacific, especially off Mexico and Central America, including the Gulf of California. One of the species most often mentioned is the rose snapper, Lucanus guttatus. That matters because this is not just a weird curiosity in a lab dish. It's part of local marine ecology and potentially fisheries health. If a parasite is common enough in a population, even modest effects on growth or reproduction can matter over time. And before your brain goes, okay, so am I supposed to worry about eating fish? No, humans are not known hosts for this parasite. It's highly fish specific. Fish infected with C. exigua are generally considered safe to eat, apart from the obvious optical issue that nobody wants to find one of these in a meal and keep their appetite. The parasite leaves when the host dies, and it doesn't set up shop in people. So the risk here is not to your body, it's to your sense of peace. That said, the science still has gaps. A lot of the widely repeated information comes from descriptive work and secondary summaries, not from huge modern datasets. We have a good sense of the life cycle and the odd organ replacement, but much less hard data on prevalence in specific fish stocks, how infection rates change over time, or how much pressure this puts on wild populations. That's one reason this parasite keeps showing up in articles. It's famous, but it's not fully measured. The weirdness is well documented. The numbers are thinner than they should be. Now for the reproductive part, because the life cycle is somehow even more specific than the mouth takeover. Cymothoa exigua shows strong sexual dimorphism, and the oral cavity becomes a tiny social system. Juveniles arrive as mencae. The first one that gets established on the tongue stump becomes female. Later arrivals stay male in the mouth. So the parasite doesn't just commandeer anatomy, it organizes reproduction around the space it has. That is such a narrow little evolutionary solution that I almost admire it. And then I remember what it costs the fish. If you want the cleanest way to understand why scientists care about this, it's not just because it's gross, though, yes, it is memorably gross. It's because it shows how far co adaptation can go. A parasite can evolve not only to survive in a host, but to slot itself into a host's function so neatly that the host keeps eating. That raises bigger questions about how we define a body part, how we think about symbiosis versus harm, and how much of normal in nature is really just good enough to keep going. And that's where this stops being a sea monster story and becomes a biology story. Evolution doesn't ask whether the solution is pretty, it asks whether it works. In this case, the answer is yes, unsettlingly so. The parasite gets a home, the fish gets a replacement, and the whole thing happens in a space the size of a mouth. So the next time you're standing at a sink, rinsing a fish, and trying to decide whether dinner is going to cooperate, remember the mouth of that rose snapper in the Pacific. The tongue is gone, the job is still getting done, and the thing doing the work is the same thing that took the tongue in the first place. That's the image that sticks with me. Not because it's the grossest thing in the ocean, because it's the one that makes you realize how strange function can be.